Hello, I'm George Bayard. I'm the Executive Director of the Grand Rapids African American Museum and Archives. We're located at 87 Monroe Center, downtown Grand Rapids. For the time being, we are going to be moving sometime this year, so you'll have to check us out when we get our new location. But for now, you can catch us there any day, Tuesday through Saturday, 12 to 5. We are West Michigan's only museum that specializes in African American history and culture. And we're free and open to the public, so you can come every day, anytime you want. We want to make sure that you understand that we are here today to talk to you a little bit about the African American database. We are talking about the history detectives who have invited us here, along with Chris Byron, who talked about the Green Book, to do a presentation based on these database newspapers. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into this, to the story of collecting. The other side of the story is what we're doing. There we go. All right. Researching the other side of the story using historical Black newspapers. This is our main focus, and today you're going to learn a little bit about some of the newspapers that tell the story a little bit differently than the mainstream newspapers that you see all the time. The Grand Rapids Press, Detroit Free Press, they all have their ways of telling stories, but the Chicago Defender and the Baltimore Afro-American, other African-American newspapers sometimes told the story a little bit differently. So that's why we call it comparing local national news reports using the African-American newspaper database. We're exploring the other side of the history. Sometimes the history is told by one side or one person, and that's the only way that people hear it. And when you get these other newspapers, you kind of see a little bit difference in the way stories are covered. Grand Rapids African American Museum has a huge collection of newspapers, early newspapers, magazines. That seems to be what started our museum and how we had our collections start to complete themselves. We got papers from almost every century. There are African-American newspapers that showed up a little bit after these newspapers that you see here. These are anti-slavery newspapers that were all maybe in the early 1800s, late 1700s. These newspapers tended to be the forerunner for the African-American newspapers that you'll see coming up soon. Black newspapers actually started showing up 1827, and that was by Samuel Cornish and John Russroom. They are the publishers of the Freedom Journal. Philip Bell then came up a baby 10 years later with the Colored American, and then the North Star newspaper was printed by Frederick Douglass in 1847. These papers are all published by African Americans at a risky time, a risky point, because you have to remember that your audience could not read. At that time, these are all pre-Civil War. Most of the slaves and free Blacks who were out there could not read. It was against the law to learn to read. It was against the law to own a book. And it was against the law to teach a Black person to read. So printing a newspaper was pretty much risky business. So the databases that we're looking at, the papers that we're looking at, all kind of evolved in the 20th century. And they struggled to keep their circulation going. The previous papers that you saw all folded because of the readership. And the same thing happened with some of these newspapers. Not only was the readership a little faulty, but the cost, even though these papers were pennies compared to what they are today, 12 cents, 8 cents, 5 cents. That was still a considerable amount of money for people who were just out of slavery. The African-American newspapers flourished in the major cities, mainly because they started taking a role in the politics, civil rights, and business affairs. Unlike the major newspapers in the African-American community, these African-American newspapers actually kind of brought the fight for liberation and civil rights. They demonstrated racial pride, and they also were things that people could go to find out what were happening in their own community. And while showing a profit, as I said, they could be considered kind of expensive at the time until radio, when you had free information coming over the airways. This was the only form of education and entertainment sometimes that African Americans could have. So let us compare the way newspapers reported similar events in the African American community. Without generalizing, I will say that in general, African Americans have a mistrust of the mainstream media, and this was because of a history of how newspapers reported African Americans at the time. Black newspapers or newspapers championed white supremacy throughout the pre-civil rights era. These newspapers would encourage lynching. That would mean that African Americans were non-people. They had no status in life. They embraced the language of the slave auction. A lot of times they would just refer to people as the Negro or the Negress or the nigger, and instead of the courtesy titles of Mr. and Mrs. Rarely did you find that in some of these newspapers. A lot of the white northern papers cemented the stereotype of the Negro brute, the guerrilla, these racial and ethnic terms that were synonymous with crime. So that was one of the things that built the mistrust in the African American community. They'd also refer to people as the Negro ruffian or colored cannibal, dissolute negress. These are some of the derogatory terms were used to make the readers feel that Black people were less than human. Historically, the white newspapers in Alabama, California, Mississippi, Kentucky, all around the country, after a while apologized because they realized after years of mistreating African Americans, it was blatantly racist, and that their coverage sometimes over a course of 100 years, because this was all started pre-Reconstruction and actually goes all the way up to almost the present time. So you can see that there's this mistrust built up in the African American community based on just the terminology that a lot of the newspapers were using. A prime example of this is the Tulsa Tribune. About 100 years ago in Greenwood, which was a prosperous part of Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was called the Black Wall Street. It was probably one of the most prosperous places in the United States for African Americans. There were stores and shops and businesses all up and down. At one point, a white mob decided they were going to destroy the whole town. They burned it to the ground and killed about 300 people, making it one of the worst race riots ever. Millions of dollars of damage was done to the property, and some of the property was just simply stolen. The local newspaper, which was a Tulsa Tribune, the morning before that riot published a report or an article that said "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The story behind it is that Dick Rowland was I think he was like a janitor who worked in this Drexel building, and he was just going on the elevator, kind of tripped and fell, and the lady who was an elevator operator, I guess, he kind of stepped on her foot or tried to hold on to his arm to keep the braces fall, and the paper reported that he attacked and assaulted her. It didn't matter that he didn't do it, and that was not what why he was in the elevator. But a mob came and got him out of jail, lynched him, and then burned the whole city to the ground. It's a well-documented case now. One of the problems was that the Tulsa Tribune silenced the whole affair for like 75 years. If you went into Tulsa, you wouldn't be able to find anything about Greenwood, except for a few African-American newspapers that were still there and still had documented a lot of what happened there that day. There was also a case of, I think last year when they had this anniversary, many of you may have seen that there were still survivors. There was at least 3 or 4 survivors in their hundreds that were there at the time of the Tulsa riots. And that eyewitness account is very powerful now. But because the Tulsa Tribune used the words attack and assault in their article, it was what provoked this riot that killed 300 people. Actually, I saw the editor for the Tulsa Tribune, the current editor, on NPR sometime last year, and he was one of those papers that apologized. He realized that his paper not only caused it, but they had covered it up for 75 years. Grand Rapids African American Museum is also collecting data about a book on Comstock Row. Comstock Row is the first housing unit that African Americans stayed when they moved here into Grand Rapids in the early 1870s. C.C. Comstock, soon to be the mayor of Grand Rapids, had a pail and barrel factory that he recruited workers from around the country, particularly African Americans. And when they got here, they stayed in this building, a picture that you see on the screen there. Comstock's Row is what it was called. It was 20 units of 8 by 10 size rooms with smaller sleeping quarters overhead. The people that came and worked in the factory also lived in this unit, at least temporarily. But everything that we saw about it, all the articles that popped up, every time we put the word in, there was either a negative connotation or something that had to do with crime. There's very few positive things that were written about Comstock Row. One of the things that we did find out was that people didn't stay there very long. It was kind of a starter home. They would come and start working for a little while, and then they said, I'm moving out of here. And they'd see surrounding area on Colebrook or Mason or other streets and getting to better housing. So it was more transient, and I don't think it was even there that long, maybe 5 or 6 years that the Comstock Row was even there. But all of the articles that we had, these are all articles that come from Grand Rapids papers, either the Daily Eagle or Grand Rapids Leader, Grand Rapids Press, or Grand Rapids Evening Press. And it was kind of shocking just to see that everything that came up was some kind of a crime report or some kind of negative term for Comstock's Row. The cases go, a very sad case of destitution and distress. They talk about another person who was stealing wood from the pump works. Another man had delirium tremors in front of Comstock Row. And then they have this one report, War of the Races, a pale face and an Ethiop came into a fight. And so, you have a term there, negative term for both white and black people. It also has a negative connotation for the place itself. It was lampooned as the Ethiopian Hotel when it was reported that it was overcrowded and that people really wanted to stay there, but they needed more room. the article suggests that they put a wing on and call it Hotel d'Afrique. So there are all these negative connotations. There's even one here that says Battle of the Nigs. Several of Mr. Comstock's buildings in the upper Canal Street were occupied by Negroes and Negresses. And so it goes on and on. We found a few positive articles, but certainly the negative ones outweighed the positive ones. The Comstock Row, which is now North Monroe Street, near the river, is where it was located. And then around the country, there are other headlines and articles from mainstream newspapers that again denigrated and downgraded African Americans or their plight. In an article from the Daily Argus leader, Emmett Till, he was a 13-year-old boy who went down to Mississippi and allegedly whistled at a white woman. They lynched him and sunk his body in a river. And then, it was a trial that acquitted the people who did it. But they describe him as a husky lad. He's a 14-year-old boy, and they also described him as a stuttering, city-wise kid. So they had all these negative terms even before the trial was committed. There's another article about the Montgomery bus boycott, in which the Montgomery Advertiser writes, it's wrong to hold the bus company hostage. Segregation dominates Montgomery and will for a long time. So they're actually upfront about segregation and how it has no place in Alabama, that it's going to be there for a long time. In the Greensboro sit-ins, where students were sitting at the lunch counter to try and integrate the lunch counters, the New York Times even writes that it was generally considered more of a college fad, like a panty raid. So you have these newspapers that are not looking at the plight of African Americans in a serious nature. In the march for Montgomery into Selma, the Plain Dealer wrote a published article from a Methodist bishop that calls the march a great disservice to the cause of human freedom, not knowing that there were plenty of ministers and bishops and priests along with Dr. King on that march. On the Freedom Riders, the Anderson Star wrote that that regardless who was to blame for this hoodlumism, and the hoodlumism in this term was a white mob that came and pulled people off the bus and beat them and bombed the bus. They complained that it cost them millions and billions of dollars to put up with this hoodlumism. And one of the things that we found out about that freedom ride to Anniston, Alabama, was that a local man, Walter Bergman, and his wife, Virginia, were part of that bus ride. In that picture that you see of the burning bus, that is Walter Bergman standing in the center. And he was beaten by the Klan. I think he was hospitalized, was wheelchair bound for the rest of his life, I believe, and then finally moved back here to Grand Rapids. And the African-American papers, the headlines were slightly different. The New York Amsterdam News writes of that same instance in Anniston, Alabama, that it was inhuman. They took the side of the people who were getting beat and burned, instead of talking about how costly it was, as the Anderson Star wrote. Some of the other headlines that give more of a positive slant from the database papers are the Portland Observer. I don't think that's in the database yet, but the Portland Observer did talk about the National Urban Leagues survey is underway, and that was something that would promote and help direct funds and resources to the African American community. Pittsburgh Courier blast J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI for calling Dr. King a notorious liar, and they took homage with that, as well as writing a story about some white Mississippians who were trying to calm the racial hatred down in Mississippi. So so you see where they're taking a positive spin on some of the same problems. In the Chicago Defender, above the headline or above the banner, President Truman wipes out segregation in armed forces. It's amazing that they even wrote an extra about this executive order by the president. And in some papers, there was maybe one line about it, not even a headline at all. Sometimes even not even mentioned at all in some newspapers. The last one is the St. Louis Argus, talks about the number of people that came to the funeral of Emmett Till. Emmett Till's body, after it was pulled out of the river, was sent back to Chicago. His mother, Mamie Bradley, decided to have an open casket funeral, and she wanted the world to see what they had done to her son. Shortly after that funeral, she spoke here in Grand Rapids at the AME church, and I think we have even a clip of that someplace where there were at least 2,000 or 3,000 people at the church to hear her speak. Another case here in Grand Rapids was the Emmett Bolden versus Keefe Theater case. This particular case was a case of discrimination where Dr. Bolden and some guests came down to the Keefe Theater, which was over on Lion Street, I believe. If you see the picture here in the slide, this area is the balcony area, which was reserved for African Americans. The customary discrimination said you couldn't sit on the ground floor where Dr. Bolden and his guests wanted to sit. He didn't get mad. He just went home and hired 2 lawyers, and he sued the Keefe Theater, which was, as I said, the Grand Rapids Operating Corporation. The Supreme Court had given up trying to mend these lawsuits, and they had said that the federal government had given up defending the civil rights of former slaves and their children, and that the federal government could not make Congress issue laws of segregation, prohibiting segregation, instead leaving it up to the states to do. But Lawyer Green and Lawyer Skinner helped to end the customary segregation here in Grand Rapids by, as I said, suing the theater. The judges in the case, in the very first case of it, one was Judge Verdier, and his rulings were just straight up racist. They were, it just didn't seem like good law to me. I'm not a lawyer, but it just seems like a funny way to try and dismiss a case when you use the excuse that the upper seats in the Keefe Theater were just as comfortable as the seats on the first floor. It just doesn't sound like good legal footing to me. If a man had been denied, if a white man had been denied a seat on the first floor because of his race, no complaint would have been made. Therefore, he would have no cause for damages. Huh? I mean, I still can't understand that. Because no hypothetical white man would have hypothetically complained, to provide damages to Dr. Bolden would give him more rights than a white man. And those are kind of shaky grounds, legal grounds, and you can see why the Supreme Court of Michigan overturned that verdict and made it a blow against Jim Crow. As a matter of fact, that was how Justice Sharp described it, a forcefully rebuff of any theoretical or practical defense of Jim Crow practices in the state of Michigan. He wrote that the public safety and welfare of our people demand that when the public are invited to attend things in public, that they shall be no discrimination among those permitted to enter because of race, color, or creed. And that was grounded in the legal legal wranglings that all men are equal before the law. So you see kind of differences in the court's opinion, and then the way it was covered also was different. Headlines in the major newspapers really didn't print very much about the reversal. Hardly any of them printed Judge Verdier's law or his reasoning for the trial, because maybe, I don't know if it was because it's so racist or they just didn't have room in their paper for it. But even the reversal from the Supreme Court, we had trouble even finding one headline about it. Usually it was in small print on the legal page, maybe one half of a paragraph or one half of a line that would even describe a reversal. Whereas in the African-American papers, it was touted as a blow against Jim Crow tactics. This was a huge blow, and in our African-American newspapers, it was viewed as a major accomplishment. About the same time in Detroit, Ossian Sweet was a doctor who moved into a white neighborhood very shortly after a white mob, hostile mob, started to protest by throwing rocks and bottles into his home, breaking windows until someone shot out, killed a white man and wounded another one. Immediately, the Sweets and his wife and other associates that were in the house were all arrested and charged with murder. The jury couldn't agree on the first trial, and the judge declared a mistrial. So the other courts accepted a motion to sever the defendants so that they would only get to the person who supposedly pulled the trigger, which was Henry Sweet, and then an all-white jury acquitted him. So then everybody else under him were also denied or were released. And so once that was done, the NAACP stepped in and helped to support the trial, the new trial. So they were able to hire Clarence Darrow, who was a major national news figure from the Snoop's trial that he had just come off of. And so people knew his name, and he took on the Sweets as clients and had all the charges dismissed against everybody by the time he finished with the trial. In the resulting headlines from those trials and those proceedings were from Port Huron, Times Herald. They said killing brought Detroit race riots to an end. One of the things that's kind of different about it is that when they use the term race riots, it seems like it's always intended to be white people against black people, or black people being the rioters. In this case, there was a white mob, which makes it an interesting headline because people would read it and they would think that it were black people who were doing the damage, and that the killing was due to the race riots. The Chicago Defender took the positive spin of freed Dr. Sweet and the 8 others. They wanted to have make sure that the public knew that these people were being railroaded, and that it says a man has the right to buy and live anywhere. He also has the right to defend his home, and that was the sentiment that they wanted to get out, so that other people who were in a very similar situation, moving into neighborhoods all around the country, would be able to go in, buy a house, and live in peace, and be able to protect their own home. Again, in this one, the Sweet Trials, you see, even from Grand Rapids, 10 Negroes are held for murder of man in Detroit, where they paint the Sweets as murderers without a trial. And they mentioned the person who got killed first as the I guess to build sympathy for him, even though he was one of the people that were throwing rocks and bottles. Whereas the Amsterdam News takes an approach of ignorance, intolerance, prejudice, and bigotry being the causes of all the troubles, which is more accurate, because that's what caused it. If there wasn't that prejudice and bigotry about somebody moving into your neighborhood, there wouldn't have been any need to go shooting at people. So you see the difference in the two headlines. The other thing we looked at was baseball, or sports in general, but we used Jackie Robinson because he was the first African-American player to cross the color line and play Major League Baseball. But he wasn't only that, he was also a hero because of his willingness to sacrifice his life for the cause of racial inequality and equal justice. Dr. King called Jackie Robinson a larger-than-life civil rights leader, because he was a sit-inner before the sit-ins and a freedom rider before the freedom rides. And that kind of sums it all up about the way Jackie Robinson portrayed his baseball career. We know too that when he got in, that he suffered much abuse, and that that was one of the ways that he kind of elevated himself as a person, not only as a baseball player, but to much of white America, he was just the first Black ball player. There was no other social or civil kind of attributes attached to Jackie Robinson. The pioneering newspaper reporters that helped Jackie Robinson, Sam Lacey, Wendell Smith, Joe Bostic, were all instrumental in helping Jackie Robinson become the first African-American ball player. Not only did they try to get Jackie Robinson in the major leagues, but they had a whole list of players that played in the Negro Leagues, and Jackie Robinson did play for Kansas City Monarchs for a short time before he went to the big leagues. They all covered the Negro Leagues. They knew that the players were equal to the players in the major leagues, and continually gave the commissioner a list every year of players that they should look at that would be candidates to cross the color line, so to speak. Jackie Robinson eventually was chosen because of his demeanor, because he wasn't somebody that would go off on some people, even though he suffered a lot of indignity. Wendell Smith became his mentor. Once Jackie Robinson signed for the Brooklyn Dodgers, he was not instantly welcomed. People knew his ability on the baseball field, but they knew it also came with trouble, pretty much. Wendell Smith knew this, and that's why he carried a green book with him. Christine would be happy to hear this, that Wendell Smith had a green book, and when the Brooklyn Dodgers would travel to like St. Louis, Wendell would get out his green book and and go over to Jackie and say, we can't stay where the team is staying. We have to stay in this house, or we have to eat here, or we have to travel this route to get to the next destination. And Wendell Smith became a good comrade for Jackie Robinson and traveled with him for that whole first year of his career in Brooklyn and then to LA. Even the headlines were a little bit different. What I found during our research was that the major papers did treat him as the first African-American to break the color line, but that was pretty much it. After that, they just got into the ball scores. They just Jackie Robinson joins team, or Jackie Robinson first Negro into the major leagues. And then that was it. You really found nothing else written about him unless it was a baseball game where they were playing. Whereas the Michigan Chronicle and some of the other African-American newspapers went deeper. They talked about Robinson, his family, his career at UCLA, and made him more of a personality. And then this article here says that he's more popular than Joe Louis. Joe Louis was a fan favorite, and then when Jackie Robinson made it into the major leagues, their popularity started to kind of compete with each other. But that was the kind of thing that the Black reading public was really looking for, and they gave more of a positive spin to something where Jackie Robinson himself was having, trouble even adjusting to the major leagues initially. The other thing was that the Negro Leagues themselves weren't covered very much by the major newspapers. They were literally omitted, whereas the African-American newspapers had, full scores, write-ups, stories about the players, and it was one of the ways that Major League Baseball was able to start to look through the statistics and the stories and find players that eventually they could invite up to the major leagues. I use the box scores because the box scores are identical in the Negro Leagues, in the major leagues, in AAA and Little League. The way you score a baseball game is the same. A K is still a strike, a BB is still a walk, and a RBI is still a run batted in. When you score the baseball game, they look the same. So the statistics should stay the same. If somebody hit 3 home runs in a game in the Negro Leagues, it would be equal to hitting 3 home runs in the major leagues. And it wasn't until last year that Major League Baseball finally accepted the statistics of the Negro League players, and it bumped the rankings around where Oscar Charleston, you see his tombstone on the picture there. He moved up a couple notches in on-base percentage. Now I think he's the leader on on-base percentage, and he might have bumped out Ty Cobb or Barry Bonds or Babe Ruth. So now the newspapers themselves, because they were so accurate keeping the statistics, now make it easier for Major League Baseball to use those statistics to add these Negro League players into baseball history and make it easier for them to get into the Hall of Fame. The major papers a lot of times didn't disagree on everything. Sometimes they agreed on things like when Dr. King came out against the Vietnam War. Some papers, African American database and the regular newspaper database showed that they were all very disheartened with Dr. King to take that stance. When you read deeper, you find that there were still even people on both sides that did respect Dr. King. They just could not connect it to the problems that were happening in the African American community, and that soldiers were African-American soldiers made up a disproportionate amount of the soldiers in Vietnam. One of the things that we found that was interesting was that when Dr. King came out, he made a speech that was actually exactly 1 year before he was assassinated. And in that speech, he said, "Let me say finally that I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America." I found many articles that had it starting out with, "I oppose the war in Vietnam," but they left out "because I love America." And Dr. King goes on to say why he was opposed to the war, but a lot of people didn't want to hear that. They just wanted to paint him with a broad brush and say he's anti-war. Now he's an anti-war protester. So it's again the way the papers see the different headlines and the way they look at their own readership, I think. One of the other things that was great about the African-American newspaper database was the fact that it is great for genealogists. And we're members of the West Michigan Genealogy Society, and I can tell you that any extra resources that you have that can help you trace your roots, get information on births or deaths or marriages or community news is very helpful. One of the things that we were surprised to see was that this column entitled Michigan State was written by the wife of Floyd Skinner, who was one of the lawyers in the Keith Theater trial. Hazel Skinner wrote for the Detroit, or well, not Detroit, she wrote for Chicago Defender from 1934 to 1939. And she wrote a social column. It was about Grand Rapids and the Lakeshore. And it became so popular that it was picked up by the major news, I guess wire services, they called it then. But it is chock full of information about funerals, about weddings, about people, and about Grand Rapids. And there's, I think it was I want to say a weekly column, and there's about 4 or 5 years of them. We haven't gone through all of them yet, but just in a brief scan of it, there's one that we have here that mentions that the junior NAACP met last week with MC Goldsby. MC Goldsby, Melvin Goldsby, if people don't know him, he's one of the major researchers. He passed away now. He was one of the major researchers here in Grand Rapids and one of the major people doing genealogy. We talked with him many times before he passed, and it's just interesting to see his name as a junior member of the NAACP. And they mentioned the Indigo Club here in Grand Rapids, and then a lot of information about a funeral that has deepened family relationships that you might not even get in a regular obituary. So it's a great document, and something that if anybody's doing genealogy out there, you might want to check out that column that's part of the Chicago Defender. The other thing for me is a personal one where the other way we get information is oral history. And my grandmother used to talk about my uncle who, if they had Grand Theft Auto, he'd be on the cover of it in those days. He was, his dad was a auto mechanic, and there wasn't a car he couldn't steal. And so he used to tell these stories where he drove off a bridge and into a swamp and then swam across the swamp, and they got, he would do all these things. And when I put the name in, I was just shocked to see this whole story pop up, that the same story that my grandmother and my mother would tell over and over again. And so now I have it here in documentation, sent it to my relatives at Christmas time, and they were like all shocked. Where'd you get this? Where'd you get this? So it's a great thing, even if you're looking for personal genealogy. I got this one from the Philadelphia Tribune, and then was able to look it up more in the Wilmington paper where it actually happened. So it's actually a great resource for genealogists. And when you log on to the site, you're going to see this page. You can type in any of your search names or items or dates, and they'll all pop up with the African American newspapers at the bottom. And I believe they add more in as people get the data. And this is the ProQuest African American Historical Papers Black Newspaper Collection, and it is through the Grand Rapids Public Library. So as I said, parts of our history have been lost, stolen, or distorted, omitted for the record. And if we can just access this data, it helps us to kind of complete the history or complete the stories that we're telling about different historical people or events. So we want to thank the ProQuest African American newspaper databases for now giving us a glimpse of the other side of history. And this is the end, or as I said, it could be the beginning. And we also want to thank the history detectives for making this program possible. All the resources you see on the screen here are part of the people who helped put this together. And we're just so happy to be a part of this project. So thank you. And as I said, if you're in a neighborhood, stop down at GRAAMA. And if you want to contact us, you can go onto our website at www.graama.org. So thank you very much.